Great Responsibility, Chapter 30, Home Again. Happy pulled the black Audi up in front of a small house in a quiet suburb. Even from here, Piper could see the blue front door. She remembered playing on that now empty porch. She took a deep breath. Happy turned in his seat.
"I'm gonna wait out here for you, okay?"
Piper shook her head. "No, Happy. Dad's gonna need you. Uncle Rhodey's visiting. You know how they get. I'll call you if I need you. Thanks." With another deep breath, Piper opened the door of the Audi, grabbing her backpack and waving at Happy. She watched him drive away, just to be sure she was really alone. Then she turned to the house. The windows were dark. Staring down at her, the dead eyes of a past long left behind. She took another deep breath and made her way up the broken and cracked walkway, pulling a brand new key out of her pocket. Pepper had given it to her this morning. That seemed to be the only thing that had changed. The locks. She slipped the key into the lock and turned it, opening the door into a dark and tiny front hall. Everything was so much smaller than she remembered. Then again, it had been 12 years since she'd been back here. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. Pepper hadn't been lying. Nothing had even been moved. Everything was just like she dimly remembered it. She reached over and tried the light switch. To her slight surprise, it worked. Pepper must have gotten the power up and working again. With the living room light on, Piper saw that what had been hulking outlines in the dark was just the furniture still sitting in the room. She allowed herself a small smile at the VHS player that rested beneath a TV set. She still hadn't taken more than one step into the room. With another deep breath, slightly inhibited by the cloud of dust her first step had stirred up, she began to wander. The downstairs didn't have much in the way of anything interesting. A living room with 12-year-old technology sitting unused for so long, Piper would be astonished if it still turned on. A kitchen. Someone had been through here after her parents' deaths. It seemed, for every piece of food had been removed and the refrigerator had been scrubbed clean, along with the freezer. Piper thought that was a bit odd, but at least the place didn't smell like mold. A small guest bedroom and a bathroom next to the garage. Nothing special. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing in the drawers but the usual spare keys and erasers and the like. Nothing like her dream. Shaking her head and starting to believe it was all her imagination, Piper began to head up the creaky stairs. This was where things got a bit more emotional. Her old room, the one that she'd lived in until she was 3, was just off to the left, and she paused before gently pushing open the door that miraculously still had plastic glow-in-the-dark stars that spelled out her name sticking to it. The room was painted yellow. It had once been bright, now dulled with age and dust. Some of the stars and planets that had once stuck to the ceiling had fallen to the floor. None of them glowed anymore, as if they had stopped when the family that had once been happy here had crumbled to pieces. There was a small bed in the corner. It was simple, white with dusty princess sheets still in their place. A desk held an assortment of books, most of them small, but some choose-your-own-adventure novels and toys rested on a small bookshelf. Some clothes still lay scattered on the floor, a mix of small, fluffy pink things and the much more well-used boys' clothes. Her parents had let her pick her own clothes at 2, and she'd turned out to be a tomboy even back then. Piper let out a soft chuckle as she spotted a small snow leopard slightly under the blankets. She remembered it. Her father had bought it for her after their first visit to the zoo, where she'd decided she wanted to be a biologist. Her parents had been so proud of her. She picked up the old dusty toy. It wasn't much bigger than her hand. She tucked it into her backpack. Turning, she spotted notches in the doorframe and grinned. There were only 2. The first one was labeled Piper, 2 years old. The other, Piper, 3 years old. She turned down the hall. A bathroom lay next to her room. She paused at the old end table that sat next to the door to the study. The same one from her dream. She tried opening it. It was locked. She sighed. Maybe there would be a key in the study, but she wasn't quite ready to go in there just yet. So instead, she headed into her parents' room. There were books on the bookshelf, and she blew off some dust off the titles. Science journals, a few novels, and other titles lay there. One of the books had something sticking out of it. Piper pulled it out, curious. It was a science journal on the theory of cross-species genetics, written by a Dr. Otto Octavius. The thing sticking out of the book turned out to be a picture from one of those booths you found at the carnival, and the like. It pictured her mother and father, much younger than she ever remembered them being. She smiled and tucked it back into the journal and tucked it into her bag. It looked like an interesting read. She stepped over to the vanity and blew the dust off a small picture frame. She smiled, tears building in her eyes. It was her father, aunt, and uncle gathered around her mother in a hospital bed. There was a small pink bundle in her mother's arms, the red face of a crying baby glaring at the camera. She opened the back of the frame and slipped the photo out into the journal. She turned to step to the other bookshelf and felt something crack under her foot. She took a step back and saw that one of the frames from the wall must have fallen off. Carefully, she flipped it over. The glass had cracked, but it was the picture that confused her. Her mother and father standing in the lobby of what could only be Stark Tower. Again, much younger than she had ever known them, but what confused her further was a young Tony Stark shaking hands with her father and grinning his signature grin at the camera. She took that photo with her as well. Much the same rested on the next bookshelf. The only difference seemed to be a small jewelry box. Piper tried to open it, but it too was locked. She turned back to the vanity and opened the drawers. It took some time, but eventually she found a small key that fit the box. It opened with a creak and revealed that, like she thought, it held her mother's jewelry. But what surprised her was that her parents' wedding rings were resting in the box, too. She pulled them out and slipped them on a gold chain she found in the box before fastening it around her neck. But why hadn't they been wearing them when they got on the plane? It didn't make sense. With a sigh, she set the box back down. There wasn't much else in this room, just the bed and the closet still full of clothes. It was time to go through the study. Chapter 31. The Study. Like everything else, most of the study was covered in dust. But unlike the rest of the house, not everything was where she remembered it being. The last vague memory of this room she could muster up was of a room torn apart, papers everywhere, and a window sitting open. But as she pushed the door open, she saw an immaculate room, no papers scattered around. It almost looked too clean. There was less dust here than there had been anywhere else in the house. She sighed in confusion as she leaned on the end table, just studying the room from the outside for a moment. Her thumb made contact with the lock, and there was a small flash of light and a beep, then a click, and the drawer opened. Piper swore and jumped. That shouldn't have been possible. She got onto her knees and examined the lock. Something was off about it. She managed to hook her thumbnail under the edge of the metal, and with a small amount of her enhanced strength, popped it off. There was a scanner under it. A fingerprint scanner. She recognized the design, obsolete for years, but there could be no doubt of what it was. Standing again, she opened the drawer. Like everything else, there was a slight layer of dust. The knives in the drawer were old and slightly rusted, and there was a place for what looked like a sidearm that was distinctly empty. Piper stared at the drawer that looked like it had been pulled straight from her dream for a moment, stunned. Then she turned to the study. Stepping inside, she ignored the desk and shelves of books. Instead, she turned to the wall to the left of the window and stared at the photos there. Pictures of her at preschool and her parents at the park. The wallpaper was an old dusty green. None of the photos had fallen off the wall here. She approached the wall cautiously. She gathered up a handful of dust and blew it at the wall, watching as the still rather early morning light made the dust dance and swirl in the air until it vanished into the wall. Or, more accurately, into a crack in the wall so minuscule Piper still couldn't quite make it out. She closed her eyes, trying to remember which picture her mother had pushed aside in her dream. She reached out and turned a photo of her parents' wedding. It stayed on its side, and under it was an old dusty handprint scanner. Piper paused. What if it wouldn't work for her? She shook her head. The fingerprint scanner had. It made sense that this would too. She laid her hand on the scanner and light flashed before the wall creaked open. It only made it halfway open before it stopped, the mechanism so old it barely worked anymore. Piper shoved the door the rest of the way open. The room from her dream was real. Here it sat before her, stripped of everything but the metal desk. She swore it was empty. All this work to find a thing she hadn't even thought was real, and it was completely empty. She began tearing through the papers in the study, nothing out of the ordinary, just pages of theorems and science projects, nothing useful, not to her, not right now, no explanations. She swore and went back over the house with a fine-toothed comb. It was nearly 2:00 when she gave up her search, flopping into the chair at the desk in the study, with tears of frustration building in her eyes. Her phone buzzed. She answered without checking the caller ID. Hello? There was a pause.
Piper, are you okay? You sound upset.
It was Harry. She scrubbed her face and cleared her throat. I'm fine, Hare. What's up? She turned in the chair and spotted a photo on the desk she hadn't paid attention to before.
Well, I've got this really cool thing to show you. Can you meet me at the penthouse?
Piper grabbed the photo as an idea popped into her head, a forgotten bit of her dream coming crashing back into her head. I can't right now, Harry. I'm out of town. I'll call you later, okay? She set down the photo of her aunt and uncle and grabbed her backpack, racing for the door.
Piper, this is really important. Is there any way you could get on the jet I know you have access to?
Piper shook her head as she put Harry on speaker and opened her Uber app. Harry, I'm sorry, but I can't. In the heat of the moment, she decided to tell him the truth, or at least some of it. It's about my parents. Harry was silent.
Will I see you at school tomorrow?
Piper hopped into the back of a silver Lexus and held her hand over the speaker of her phone as she gave the driver, a middle-aged Lebanese man, the address of her aunt and uncle's old house. I hope so, Harry. I have to go. He nodded and let her hang up as he stared down at the watch that lay on his desk. He slid it onto his wrist and clicked the button that would normally stop the watch. Instead, a black, slimy substance covered him. He grinned at the mirror. The suit looked a lot like a black and white version of Spider-Girl's costume. He felt powerful and happy. He turned to his window and spoke to himself.
Let's go do something worth telling Piper.
He leapt out of the window, swinging away on a black web line.